my life in white hands. You my secret weapon, 'cause you one of the bad guys.
Objection, Your Honor. The witness's opinion on this matter is irrelevant.
Your Honor, I believe Deputy Looney has earned the right to speak here today.
Hi guys, welcome to our channel. In Canton, Mississippi, an intrepid young attorney and his assistant defend a black man accused of murdering two white men who raped his young daughter. The court's jurors are all white, so this lack of justice presents him with a huge challenge. Check the title of the movie in the description. The movie begins with the mobbing of two white men named Billy Ray Cobb and James Willard. After bullying and robbing a black store, they see a 10-year-old African-American girl named Tonya on the road and decide to harass her. While heading to her home, young Tonya is taken brutally by them and is cruelly raped and beaten. The two abandoned her in a nearby river after unsuccessfully trying to hang her. Her mother, Gwen, becomes increasingly concerned when she realizes her daughter has not returned home after a few hours. She contacts Carl Lee, her husband, while he's at work, and upon his arrival home, he discovers his young girl on the couch in the living room, surrounded by the neighbors, visibly injured and covered in blood. Carl Lee is shocked by what happened to his daughter and is filled with an unwavering will to seek justice. Tonya is rushed to the hospital as her condition hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard, despite resisting Sheriff Ozzie, are arrested by him and confess their guilt. Deputy Dwayne Powell informs this tragic incident prominent city attorney Jake Brigance, who previously defended Carl Lee's brother in court, and makes him anxious. Later, Carl Lee visits Jake and is assured by him that the rapists will finally be released after a few years in prison, and this bothers him. He inquires about Jake's response to a horrifying scenario involving his own daughter being subjected to a heinous crime. In turn, Jake reveals that he would take matters into his own hands and seek justice by eliminating the perpetrators. That night, after Jake says goodnight to his daughter Hannah, he joins his wife, Carla. He confesses that he subconsciously remembers Tonya when he looks at Hannah. At the preliminary hearing, it was established that the defendants had sufficient evidence against them to proceed to the grand jury. After that pivotal moment, Carl Lee's decision was final, so he decided to get an M16 firearm. He goes to the county courthouse and kills both attackers with a sudden attack to take revenge for his abusive behavior towards his daughter. Still, Deputy Dwayne Looney is accidentally shot in the leg in this shooting. After making sure that Cobb and Willard have met their demise, Carl Lee stops shooting and flees back to his humble home. Hours later, Sheriff Ozzie arrives and arrests him after saying goodbye to his family and takes him to the police station. Tomorrow morning, Jake will be summoned by Carl Lee to accept his representation in this case. Although Carl Lee does not have the financial ability to pay Jake's lawyer's fee, he accepts the handling of this case and announces it publicly in front of reporters and media. On the opposite side is his rival lawyer, Rufus Buckley, who has many motivations to defeat him and, in this case, sees the opportunity he has always been waiting for. Jake's interview has made him a well-known figure among the people. In other words, Buckley claims that he will win this case and request the execution of Carl Lee according to the law. Jake goes to his old friend Lucian, a veteran but disqualified lawyer, and asks him to help him with the case. He suggests that Jake request a change of venue to a county with a larger population of black citizens to potentially ensure a more diverse jury. In addition, he offers Jake strategic advice for his defense, such as considering an insanity plea to potentially help the Carl Lee case. After the funeral, the brothers of the dead, Freddie and Winston, are furious and ready to do anything to make sure Carl Lee is executed. That night, while Jake is watching his interviews on TV with his family, he receives his first threatening phone call. The next day, the first trial begins with Omar Noose judging. Jake pleads Carl Lee not guilty because of insanity, so the trial is adjourned to July 22, and the judge denies bail. Judge Noose opposes changing the location of the court, and while explaining this to Jake, a girl named Ellen Roark appears out of nowhere and places documents on Jake's desk. Based on these documents, there is a history of not replacing an appeals court in the Supreme Court, which ultimately caused the violation of the court's decision, and these documents forced Judge Noose to review Jake's request. Jake and Roark smile at each other. That night, before Jake goes home, Ellen waits for him in front of the office to meet him. She is a student and legal consultant with a history of several successful cases. Since the Carl Lee case is critical, she has a lot of motivation to help Jake as a consultant. She even claims she has a rich father, so she doesn't ask for any salary. But eventually, Jake rejects her help. Before saying goodbye, Ellen gives her business card to Jake so that he might change his mind. Meanwhile, Freddie plans to avenge Billy's death by joining and enlisting the help of the Mississippi branch of the Ku Klux Klan and its Grand Dragon, Stump Sisson, to ensure Carl Lee's conviction and death sentence by any means necessary. Stump wants him to form a group of thousands of people and seems to have sinister plans for Jake and his family. Carl Lee, with the consent of Sheriff Ozzie, visits Dwayne, who had to amputate Dwayne's right leg due to his accidental shooting. Carl Lee does not regret the murder he committed, but he apologizes for hurting him. Freddie and his men, including corrupt Officer Hastings, are determined to raise tensions in the city. Simultaneously, the black community gathered for a ministerial council meeting, where a group of black preachers came together to strategize and mobilize political efforts in Ford County's black communities. They understand the importance of supporting Carl Lee through demonstrations and fundraising for a skilled attorney, and their goal is to secure Carl Lee's freedom. On the other hand, they plan to hire a new lawyer for Carl Lee in a political effort. Gwen visits Carl Lee and informs him that Tonya will never have children, and that not having enough money to buy the necessities of life has made things very difficult for them. The black preachers meet with Carl Lee and try to pressure him to replace Jake with a new lawyer. Still, he uses the opportunity to force them to provide financial assistance to his family in his absence. Otherwise, he will destroy their political credibility in the future. He also emphasizes that he does not intend to replace Jake with another lawyer. One night, a stranger who introduces himself as Mickey Mouse calls Jake's house and warns Carla to leave soon. Suddenly Freddie and his men put a burning cross in front of their house to force Jake to resign as Carl Lee's attorney by threatening them. Sheriff Ozzie makes it in time, but Carla is still worried about the consequences of Jake's decision and blames him for the threats they are about to face. In addition, Ethel, the secretary of Jake's office, informs him that they are receiving threatening calls at home. That evening, Jake chats with his friend and colleague Harry in the restaurant, and accidentally, they see Buckley and Judge Noose together. Moments later, Ellen enters and presents evidence that in most criminal courts, insanity pleas make up less than 1% of cases. Harry greatly admires her, but Jake still refuses to use her as a legal advisor on his team. After that, Jake's house is attacked by his enemies again, but this time, with the help of Sheriff Ozzie, this terrible incident is prevented. The attacker has a time bomb in his hand with which he intends to blow up the house, but luckily, Jake throws it in the air in time so that no one gets hurt. The next morning, Jake is forced to send Carla and Hannah to his wife's family for 6 weeks until the end of the trial so that they can be safe from threats. However, Carla seems reluctant to go and worries that she might lose Jake. Judge Noose invites Jake to his house to inform him that he is against changing the location of the court. In this case, he has obtained permission from high-ranking officials. Therefore, he advises Jake to agree to the guilt of Carl Lee. In return, he promises to talk to Buckley to agree to sentence him to 20 years in prison. Jake refuses because right now, he's busy finding a psychiatrist who wants to plead insanity on Carl Lee's behalf to win his case. Finally, Lucian offers him an old psychiatrist who is one of his friends, Dr. Boss. Lucian explains that Boss is awesome when he's not drunk, and his credentials are flawless, so they decide to drink together. On the other hand, Freddie and his men watch over Ethel, attack her house at night and beat her elderly husband severely, also warning her to inform Jake that they will kill them next time. In the morning, Ellen visits Jake, who is still drunk, and invites him to lunch. At the restaurant, she claims that she is strongly against the death penalty and works as a legal consultant to prevent such trials, unlike Jake. Jake believes that the death penalty is a good and deterrent sentence, but in the case of Carl Lee, he believes that he does not deserve the death penalty. This disagreement upset Ellen, so she left the restaurant. Moments later, Jake comes out to find her, and it turns out that she wasn't gone, and admits that she went a little overboard. After that, Jake agrees to work together. Jake learns about the racist attack on Ethel's husband and goes to visit him with confusion, where he sees her with a confused and worried face. Just in time for the trial, the town seems to be deeply divided as opinions on whether or not Carl Lee should be convicted for his actions are divided. The team begins to investigate and summarize the Carl Lee case. Since the jury is all white, Jake believes they should use younger people with fewer prejudices. Jake and Buckley each choose 12 people from among the options, and the jury members must stay in quarantine until the final day of the trial. At the same time, street demonstrations in front of the courthouse between whites and blacks become more widespread until Sheriff Ozzie can't stop them from fighting. The fight begins between them, and in this conflict, Jake's leg is injured, and one person is killed horribly. Jake is being treated by Ellen to bandage his wound. He asks her to find a way to discredit the prosecutor's psychologist, who is on Buckley's team. At night, Freddie sets Jake's house on fire by throwing a burning cross, and just as he arrives, it's too late, and flames erupt in his house. Jake calls their dog Max, but there seems to be no hope for him to be alive. The next day, as Jake picks up a photo of his family that survived the burn, Harry comes to see him to comfort him. Jake continues to call his dog while Harry advises him to get off the case, then admits that he didn't believe Jake would take on such a risky case at first. He insists on his goal and doing it. He believes that if he resigns now, all this will be for nothing. Suddenly, the sound of his dog barking is heard, and it turns out that Max is still alive. On the day of the trial, police forces are stationed in front of the court to prevent tensions. Whites chant against Carl Lee, and blacks chant in his support. Jake challenges Ray Cobb's mother with questions about whether her son had raped other kids before this incident, but Buckley's objection and the judge's order stop the proceedings. However, Jake again asks Sheriff Ozzie about Ray's confession about his previous child abuse, and the sheriff confirms that this was not his first crime. Judge Noose gives him another serious warning and emphasizes that this case of Carl Lee's murder and the continuation of this process will cause him to be fined. He postpones the continuation of the trial until tomorrow at 9 a.m. Ethel has lost her husband to a heart attack, and Jake and Lucian visit her to offer their condolences before she takes his body to Oxford. Jake is sorry for what happened and has nothing to say. Ethel says that he might win this case, but they all lost. Along with Harry, Ellen is looking for a way to discredit the prosecution psychiatrist, but she has no idea. Harry shows her the way and asks her to cheat. The jury of the court, contrary to the legal protocols, with the insistence of one of them, passed the decision on whether or not Carl Lee was guilty. It seems that the majority of them agree with his guilt. The next morning, at the same time as the trial, Ellen goes to the Whitefield Psychiatric Hospital. She cleverly gets the room number of the prosecutor's psychiatrist from the receptionist. After Buckley interrogates Deputy Dwayne, Jake says he has no questions for him, but Carl Lee forces him to ask Dwayne if he is guilty. Even though this question may backfire on them, Jake reluctantly agrees to ask Deputy Dwayne this question. Fortunately, Dwayne maintains that he has no animosity towards Carl Lee and admits that he does not blame him for what he did. To his surprise, he says that Carl Lee is a hero and should be released, accompanied by the support of the blacks in the court. At the same time, Ellen secretly finds the prosecutor's psychiatrist's room and tries to find evidence against him. Dr. Wilbert Roadheaver appears in court and admits that on the day of the accident, Carl Lee's mental condition was normal without any damage, so he rejects the idea that he was insane when he killed the two. When Jake wants to interrogate Dr. Wilbert, Ellen arrives and gives him the documents. These documents prove that he has never accepted criminals as insane in all the state courts in the past 11 years, which actually weakens his testimony. The continuation of the trial is postponed until the next day. When the lawyers leave the court, reporters try to interview Jake. Suddenly, Freddy assassinates him with a sniper out of hostility and hatred. However, his shot has failed, and an agent gets shot instead of Jake. Jake and Ellen express their regrets about the shooting of that agent, and Jake believes that it was because of him that the agent was in danger, and he blames himself. After that, Ellen goes to her residence, and on the way, the police stop her car. Moments later, it became clear that he was the corrupt policeman Hastings. They kidnap Ellen, and Freddy ties her to a cross and, after tearing her clothes, calls her a whore and claims that he is going to leave her to burn in the sun until she dies and the wild animals of the forest feed on her. They let him go, but at dawn, a person with a Mickey Mouse tattoo on his arm frees her, and it turns out that he is one of Freddy's people, who now disobey him. The next day, in the court session, another psychiatrist of the prosecution, Dr. Boss, who is in Jake's team, testified that Carl Lee was insane on the day of the incident and did not understand the consequences of what he did. To his surprise, Buckle found evidence against Boss that he had been tried for raping an underage girl in the past. He has documents and photos that show that his claim is true, so he questions the competence of Dr. Boss and weakens his testimony. Jake found Lucian responsible for this case during the break because he had introduced Boss. Lucian explains that things may not always go the way he wants, so he tries to motivate Jake to find justice with an impressive speech, and asks him to be better than him. Later on, the court calls Carl Lee to testify, and after Jake interrogates him, it's Buckley's turn. He cleverly uses words to inflame Carl Lee, forcing him to declare that rapists deserve to burn in hell, words that could sway the jury's verdict against him. Jake feels defeated, and the continuation of the court session is postponed to tomorrow. He goes to the hospital when he finds out about Ellen's condition. Despite the court proceedings against his client, Jake completely accepts the defeat and says it is not worth it. Still, she says that it is not worth it when Carl Lee is executed. She believes that Jake still has a big chance tomorrow, and he should prepare for it. Jake kisses Ellen's forehead and leaves. On the other hand, the jury has reached a definite conclusion against Carl Lee, and they all unanimously believe that he is guilty. In the middle of the rainy night, Carla surprises Jake with her sudden presence, and it seems she comes to apologize for not supporting and blaming Jake. She thought that Jake had accepted this case to become popular and to show that he was a lawyer for difficult cases. Still, she knows that Jake's reason for accepting it is something else. In fact, Jake thought that the way the mobsters had raped Tonya, they might one day hurt their daughter Hannah. Then they hug each other. Tomorrow morning before sunrise, Jake visits Carl Lee to warn him about losing the case because there is no legal point to discuss. Carl Lee angrily sees Jake as someone like them, and although he tries to save him, he believes that in his subconscious, he differentiates between whites and blacks. Jake says, "You're my friend," but Carl Lee doesn't believe it and says, "You don't even know where I live or that our girls never played together." He tries to flip Jake with this sentence. "If you were on the jury, how could you be convinced to release me?" As the trial begins, Buckley tries his best to convince the jury to convict Carl Lee and further incites them to find him guilty. After that, it's Jake's turn. He admits to the jury that he had prepared a text for reading but doesn't intend to read it. Instead, he asks the jury to close their eyes so he can tell them a story. His story is actually the story of Tonya, a girl who was raped by two people after shopping in a store. They tear her clothes and rape her. They try to hang her from a tree branch, but they fail, so they hang her from a height of 9 meters by the river. Every moment as the story progresses, the violence and brutality of the aggressors become more evident, and tears flow from the eyes of the jury members and the audience. He asks the jury to imagine that the girl is white and ends his speech. Outside the court, silence fills the air for the announcement of the court's verdict. Suddenly, a little boy comes out and announces that the court's verdict for Carl Lee is not guilty. The blacks cheered, and Carl Lee thanked Jake for his incredible performance. At the end of court session, Sheriff Ozzie arrests Freddie and Winston along with the corrupt officer Hastings, and Buckley congratulates Jake on his victory in this case. Tonya returns to her father's arms, and after a few days, Carl Lee has a party with other blacks in his neighborhood to celebrate his freedom. To his surprise, Jake joins him, and Carl Lee and Gwen warmly welcome him and his wife. At the movie's end, Jake says he likes their kids to play together, and they smile at each other. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.